Chapter 1. A Death in the Mist. The small coastal town of Bridgemont lay shrouded in a thick morning fog. The tide was low, and the sea murmured in the distance like a restless spirit. Gas lamps along the cobblestone streets flickered faintly, their yellow glow barely cutting through the swirling mist. It was the kind of morning where sound seemed muffled, and every shadow hinted at something unseen. At the edge of the town, perched on a cliff overlooking the grey waters, stood Blackthorn Manor, a sprawling Victorian estate, its Gothic spires stabbing into the fog. Normally, the mansion was a place of laughter, fine dinners, and the chatter of wealthy guests. But today, its silence felt heavy, almost watchful. Inside, the drawing room smelled faintly of cigar smoke and brandy. The Persian rug was slightly askew. A vase lay shattered in a corner, and near the fireplace lay the lifeless body of Sir Reginald Ashcroft, the manor's owner. His eyes stared upward, glassy and unseeing, his face pale except for the faint bluish tinge around his lips. The butler, Mr. Hargrove, was the first to discover him. His trembling hands gripped the doorframe as he called out for help. Within minutes, the household staff had gathered, their faces pale with shock. Lady Eleanor, Sir Reginald's young second wife, stood frozen at the foot of the grand staircase, her silk dressing gown catching the light as she whispered, "It can't be true. It can't." By mid-morning, the police had arrived, 2 constables from a local station, along with Inspector Lionel Graves, a tall, sharp-eyed man with a reputation for stubbornness. Graves quickly began his work, interviewing staff, pacing the room, and scribbling notes. But by the time Miss Marple arrived at Blackthorn Manor, summoned by an old friend of the family, the inspector had already declared it an unfortunate heart attack. Miss Marple, however, did not agree. She stood quietly in the doorway, her gloved hands folded neatly over her handbag, her gaze sweeping the room. She noticed the faint indentation in the carpet, where a chair had recently been moved, the smudge of ash on the edge of the desk, and a single teacup on the side table, chipped on the rim. She also noticed something the others had missed, a faint smell of almonds in the air. And to anyone who knew their poisons, that smell could mean only one thing: cyanide. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. This was no heart attack. This was murder. Chapter 2. A House Full of Secrets. The fog still clung stubbornly to the cliffs as Miss Marple followed Inspector Graves into the manor's grand dining hall. The long oak table stretched nearly the entire length of the room, and its polished surface reflected the pale morning light spilling through the tall windows. A fire had been lit in the hearth, but it did little to chase away the chill, whether from the cold air, or the unease that seemed to hang over the place. The household had gathered at Graves' request. One by one, they took their seats along the table, their faces drawn and tense. 1. Lady Eleanor Ashcroft, barely in her 30s, strikingly beautiful, with chestnut hair cascading over her shoulders. Yet, behind the trembling hands, Miss Marple detected an alertness, a readiness. Lady Eleanor was grieving, but perhaps also calculating. 2. Charles Ashcroft, Sir Reginald's son from his first marriage. At 35, he had inherited his father's sharp jawline and sharper temper. He sat with arms folded tightly, avoiding Lady Eleanor's gaze entirely. Rumour in Bridgemont had it that Charles had never accepted his father's new wife. 3. Mr. Hargrove, the loyal butler. A man of 60 with a posture so straight, it seemed carved from wood. He had served the Ashcroft family for over 3 decades. If anyone knew the secrets of Blackthorn Manor, it was him. 4. Alice Whitmore, the housemaid, young and timid, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. She avoided everyone's eyes, her face pale as though she knew far more than she dared say. 5. Dr. Edmund Blake, the family physician. His medical bag rested on the table beside him, and his calm, professional demeanor did not waver, except for a faint twitch in his jaw when the subject of Sir Reginald's health came up. Inspector Graves began his questioning. Lady Eleanor, at what time did you last see your husband alive? Lady Eleanor's voice trembled. Just after dinner last night. Around 9. He said he was going to the study to work. I retired to my room. Graves scribbled a note, his eyes narrowing. And you didn't hear anything unusual during the night? She shook her head. No, nothing. Miss Marple, sitting quietly near the far end of the table, sipped her tea and watched everyone's faces as they spoke. Years of observation had taught her that words often lied, but expressions rarely did. When it was Charles's turn, his tone was clipped. I last saw father in the library. We argued. Argued? Graves leaned forward. About money, Charles admitted. Father had been planning to change his will. I didn't agree with his choices. There was a sharp silence in the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Lady Eleanor. She had not looked at Charles once since entering the room. In return, Charles had avoided her gaze as though contact would burn him. There was history here and tension thick enough to slice with a knife. Then Alice, the maid, spoke up in a shaky voice. I heard footsteps last night. Around midnight. In the corridor outside Sir Reginald's study. They were heavy. Not like Lady Eleanor's or mine. Every head turned toward her. And why? Graves asked slowly. Did you not mention this before? Alice's gaze dropped to her lap. Because I wasn't supposed to be awake. I was out of my room without permission. Miss Marple's lips curved in the faintest smile. The girl's honesty had cost her fear, which meant her words were likely true. Midnight, Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. And yet the body was found in the morning. She set down her teacup and glanced toward the study door visible down the hallway. The investigation had barely begun. But one thing was already clear to her. Everyone at this table had something to hide. Chapter 3 whispers behind closed doors. After the tense gathering in the dining hall, Inspector Graves decided to question each person individually. But Miss Marple, ever the polite guest, asked if she might simply observe. Graves knew her reputation, and suspected her quiet observations might yield more than his direct questioning. So he agreed. The interviews took place in Sir Reginald's study, a large room lined with leather-bound books. The heavy curtains were half-drawn, letting in thin spears of daylight. The smell of old paper, cigar smoke, and something faintly metallic lingered in the air. 1. Lady Eleanor Ashcroft. She entered gracefully, her robe replaced by a fitted black dress that seemed more suited for a high society luncheon than a morning of grief. Lady Eleanor, Graves began. You say you were in your bedroom from 9 o'clock until morning. Did anyone see you there during the night? She hesitated, just long enough for Miss Marple to notice. No, I was alone. Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. My dear, forgive my bluntness, but one rarely sleeps through an entire night without rising, especially in times of distress. A faint smile tugged at Eleanor's lips. Perhaps I am an exception, Miss Marple. Marple said nothing further, but noted the defensive tone. Eleanor was hiding a movement that night. But what? And where to? 2. Charles Ashcroft. Charles entered with the stiffness of a man bracing for a fight. Your argument with your father, Graves pressed. What exactly was said? He accused me of being irresponsible with my investments. I told him I had every right to my inheritance. He said the will was changing, in Eleanor's favour. Miss Marple looked up. And how did that make you feel, dear? Charles gave a short, bitter laugh. How do you think it made me feel? The woman's been here barely 2 years. Marple caught the flash of anger, quick, raw, and deep. But then she noticed something else. His hands. They bore faint scratches, almost hidden, but not the kind one gets from gardening. More like from breaking something. 3. Mr. Hargrove. The butler. He entered with perfect posture, though his hands trembled faintly as he adjusted his cufflinks. Hargrove, Graves asked, what was your routine last night? I retired at 11, as I always do, after ensuring the fires were banked and the doors locked. Miss Marple smiled gently. And yet, you were seen near the east corridor after midnight. His eyes flickered, only for a moment, before he replied. I sometimes walk when I cannot sleep. Marple made a note. If the butler was restless, it was not from insomnia alone. 4. Alice Whitmore, the maid. The young maid looked even paler under the study's dim light. I only heard the footsteps, miss. I didn't see who it was, but... She hesitated, biting her lip. But what? Graves asked. I thought I smelled cigar smoke in the corridor, sir. Sir Reginald was the only one who smoked. Marple's eyes sharpened. Or perhaps someone wanted it to seem that way. 5. Dr. Edmund Blake. The doctor arrived last. His face calm, but his eyes shadowed. Doctor, Graves began. Sir Reginald's cause of death. Your preliminary finding? Cardiac arrest. Blake said flatly. But under unusual circumstances. Miss Marple leaned forward. Unusual. His heart stopped suddenly. Yes, but there were traces of digitalis in his bloodstream. A heart medicine. Lethal in excess. The room went very still. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. So, we are no longer speaking of natural causes. As the doctor left, Miss Marple remained seated, gazing at the closed door. She now knew 3 things. 1. Sir Reginald was poisoned. 2. Everyone in that house had reason to want him gone. 3. Someone had walked the halls at midnight, carrying a deadly secret. The real question was, who among them had the patience, the nerve, and the cunning to make it look like fate itself had claimed him? Chapter 4. The Hidden Compartment. The morning dragged on with an unsettling stillness. Rain had begun to patter against the tall windows of Ashcroft Manor, blurring the outside world into a dull, grey watercolour. Inspector Graves had gone to telephone the coroner. But Miss Marple lingered in the study, her knitting forgotten on her lap. Something about this room troubled her. Not the books, nor the grand oak desk, but the air itself. It carried an odd scent, faint but persistent, like old varnish disturbed after years of stillness. A subtle clue. She rose slowly and walked to the large bookshelf that dominated the far wall. Most of the leather-bound volumes were covered in an even layer of dust. But one, a history of naval warfare, had a faint, clean edge along its spine, as if it had been handled recently. Miss Marple pulled it gently. To her surprise, the entire section of shelving moved with it, revealing a narrow hidden compartment behind the books. Inside was a small wooden box, its brass clasp tarnished. She hesitated for only a moment before opening it. The box's contents. Inside lay 3 items. 1. A small vial containing a few dried traces of a powdery substance, the colour of pale gold. 2. A folded letter, its edges worn from being opened and closed many times. 3. A monogrammed cufflink, stained faintly with something dark, possibly dried blood. She took the letter first. It was addressed to Sir Reginald but unsigned. The handwriting was elegant, almost feminine. If you go through with this change to the will, You will regret it. I will not be left with nothing. A sudden interruption. Before she could study the vial, the door swung open. Charles stood there, eyes narrowing. What are you doing in here, Miss Marple? She smiled pleasantly, as though she'd been admiring the books. Oh, just passing the time. I've always had a fondness for naval history. Charles glanced at the box in her hands, his jaw tightening. Some curiosities are better left untouched. He left without another word, but Marple noted the slight tremor in his voice, the kind that comes from either fear or guilt. The doctor's insight. When Dr. Blake returned to check on Graves, Marple discreetly showed him the vial. He took one look and frowned. This, he whispered, is powdered digitalis. Enough to kill a man twice over. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. Then I believe we have found our murder weapon. But the letter, that was the more dangerous discovery. It meant that the murder wasn't a crime of passion, committed in the heat of the moment. It was planned, deliberate, and cold-blooded. And somewhere in the house, the writer of that letter was watching, and wondering if Miss Marple already knew their name. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Night. Ashcroft Manor grew eerily quiet after nightfall. The storm that had rattled the windows all afternoon had passed, leaving the halls drenched in an unsettling stillness. Most of the household had retired to their rooms, but Miss Marple's mind refused to rest. The letter, the vial, and the cufflink, they formed a triangle of clues, each pointing toward a premeditated killing. But there was still one unanswered question. Who had the most to lose if Sir Reginald changed his will? A strange sound. Around midnight, she rose from her bed and slipped on her shawl. Somewhere below, in the direction of the study, she heard faint movements, the muffled scrape of wood, the subtle clink of metal. Moving silently, she descended the grand staircase. The moonlight streaming through the tall windows lit her path in patches, leaving deep pools of shadow between. She followed the sound to the study door, which was ajar. Caught in the act. Peering inside, she saw a figure bent over the fireplace, feeding paper into the flames. The firelight danced across their face just long enough for her to recognize Charles. His jaw was tight, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. Miss Marple stepped inside, her voice calm but firm. "Burning the past, Charles?" He spun around, startled, nearly dropping the envelope in his hand. This has nothing to do with you. The confrontation. "Oh, but it has everything to do with me," she replied. "That letter you're trying to destroy. Is it the one warning Sir Reginald about his will? The one that could prove motive for his murder?" Charles's face darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about." She took a step closer. "And the cufflink? I believe it's yours. Found beside a vial of digitalis. Quite a dangerous thing to misplace. Don't you think?" For a moment, Charles looked as if he might bolt. But then his shoulders sagged, and he let out a long breath. "You're clever, Miss Marple. But cleverness won't save you if you push too far." An ominous warning. He brushed past her and left the study, the smell of burned paper lingering in the air. Miss Marple knew then that Charles was hiding something vital, but perhaps not the whole truth, because in the fire's dying embers, she spotted something he had missed. Half a page of the burned letter, unscathed in the corner. The remaining words sent a shiver down her spine. "And if I cannot have my share, then neither will your precious Anna. Anna, Sir Reginald's young second wife, and possibly the real target all along." Chapter 6. The trap is set. By morning, Miss Marple had already formed the beginnings of a plan. She knew the killer was growing nervous. The burning of the letter proved it. Someone feared the truth would surface. Now, all she had to do was push them into making a mistake. the breakfast gathering. She asked Lady Eleanor, the stern housekeeper, to call everyone to breakfast in the grand dining hall. The long oak table was lined with steaming tea, buttered toast and poached eggs, but the atmosphere was as cold as the marble floor beneath their feet. Charles sat near the window, staring at his plate. Anna, pale but composed, avoided meeting his eyes. Dr. Whittaker, the family physician, kept fidgeting with his watch chain. Miss Marple took her seat at the head of the table, a position Sir Reginald once occupied, and began speaking as if she were giving a casual morning announcement. "The bait. I've taken the liberty of having Sir Reginald's study locked," she said lightly, "but not before I found something rather conclusive. The final page of the letter has been preserved." Fawkes paused in mid-air. Anna's lips parted in surprise. Charles froze completely. "I shall, of course," Miss Marple continued, "read it aloud this evening. I expect it will clear up a great many questions, including the identity of his killer." A telling reaction. It was subtle, but she saw it. A bead of sweat on Charles's temple, the tightening of Dr. Whittaker's jaw, and Anna's trembling hands. The killer was in this very room, and now they believed the evidence could destroy them. Setting the stage. After breakfast, Miss Marple quietly approached Inspector Harley. "Keep the letter safe," she instructed. "And tonight, when I make the announcement, have your men positioned at every exit. No one leaves until we have our culprit." The inspector nodded grimly. "You're certain this will work?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, my dear. The guilty never sleep well when they believe the hangman's noose is tightening." A final twist before nightfall. As the household settled into a tense day, a sudden crash echoed from the upstairs corridor. Miss Marple rushed to the source and found Anna, standing over a broken vase, tears streaming down her face. "They'll kill me," Anna whispered. "If you read that letter, they'll kill me before nightfall." Miss Marple realized her trap might work sooner than planned, but only if she could keep Anna alive long enough for the truth to come out. Chapter 7. The Long Night's Reveal. The drawing room was lit by only a few oil lamps, casting deep shadows on the panelled walls. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes like an impatient guest. Every member of the household had been summoned. Inspector Harley stood by the door, 2 constables stationed behind him. No one would escape tonight. Miss Marple sat in an armchair near the fire, a small leather folder on her lap. She appeared calm, almost grandmotherly, but her eyes were sharp, taking in every twitch, every nervous breath. "The letter that wasn't lost," she began softly. "Sir Reginald's death was no accident. It was murder, cold, deliberate, and calculated." Gasps filled the room. Dr. Whittaker shifted uncomfortably. Charles's jaw tightened. Anna clasped her hands in her lap so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "I found a page from the letter Sir Reginald intended for his solicitor," Miss Marple continued, opening the folder. "A page that named the person who had betrayed him, and who would benefit most from his death. The killer reacts." Her gaze swept the room before she read. "I have reason to believe Charles has been siphoning money from my accounts. I will confront him tomorrow, if anything happens to me." Charles shot to his feet. "This is absurd. You can't prove a word of it." "Oh, but I can," Miss Marple said, her voice still calm. "You weren't in the stables that night, Charles. You were in the study, and the mud on your boots matches the footprints outside the window. You burned the rest of the letter, but you didn't know the draft was still in the desk's hidden compartment. The final push." "You're lying," Charles shouted, but his voice cracked. "This is ridiculous." Anna suddenly stood up. "Stop it, Charles. I can't keep your secret any longer. Her voice trembled. You said it would just be an accident. But you poisoned him. Gasps erupted again. Charles's face drained of colour. You little fool, he hissed at Anna. You've ruined everything. The arrest. Before Charles could move, Inspector Harley stepped forward. Handcuffs ready. Charles Whitford, you are under arrest for the murder of Sir Reginald Whitford. As the inspector read him his rights, Charles's eyes darted to Miss Marple. You think you've won, old woman? This isn't over. Miss Marple simply folded the letter back into its folder. Oh, my dear boy. It most certainly is. Chapter 8. Shadows lifted, secrets remain. The storm had passed by morning. Thin rays of sunlight spilled across the Whitford estate, washing away the darkness of the night before. The once bustling household was eerily quiet, save for the occasional murmur of the servants, still shaken by the events. Miss Marple sipped her tea in the breakfast room, her knitting needles resting on the table beside her. Inspector Harley entered, looking more relaxed now. Loose ends. It's remarkable, Harley said, pulling out a chair. We've searched Charles's study. You were right. There's a hidden ledger of forged transactions. Years of siphoning funds. Miss Marple nodded. Greed has toppled greater men, Inspector. But there's still the matter of Anna. Anna's confession. Anna sat in the corner, her eyes red from crying. I never wanted him to die, she whispered. Charles told me Sir Reginald would be ruined financially, not dead. He said the poison would only make him ill, to frighten him into silence. Miss Marple's gaze was steady but not unkind. Sometimes, my dear, when you align yourself with a snake, you can't be surprised when it bites. Inspector Harley sighed. She faced charges, though perhaps the court will show leniency. The quiet twist. As Harley prepared to leave, Miss Marple fingered the teacup in front of her. There's one thing you should know, Inspector. The poison in Sir Reginald's brandy wasn't strong enough to kill him instantly. He might have survived, if someone hadn't tampered with his heart medication. Harley froze. You mean? Miss Marple glanced toward the door, where Mrs. Whitford, Sir Reginald's widow, had just stepped in. Her face calm, almost too calm. Grief takes many forms, Miss Marple said softly. Some wear black, others wear satisfaction. Mrs. Whitford smiled faintly. Do give my regards to the inspector. She walked past them, the click of her heels echoing down the hall. A final reflection. Harley stared after her. Can we prove it? Miss Marple shook her head. Not this time. Some truths, Inspector, must rest in the shadows until the right moment. She picked up her knitting once more. Outside, the estate looked peaceful again. But in Miss Marple's mind, one thought lingered. Chapter 9. The letter that shouldn't exist. 3 weeks had passed since the Whitford case closed, at least in the police records. Whitford Manor had returned to its slow rhythm, the servants avoiding talk of the past, and the village gossip turning to other matters. But for Miss Marple, the pieces still didn't fit neatly. A mysterious envelope. On a damp Tuesday morning, as she tended to her roses, the postman delivered a small cream-coloured envelope with no return address. Her name was written in a neat, looping hand. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore only 3 words. You were close. There was no signature, no clue to the sender, only a faint scent of lilacs clinging to the paper. Unfinished business. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, staring at the letter. She knew that scent. She'd noticed it faintly in the corridor, outside Sir Reginald's study, the night he died. It belonged not to Mrs. Whitford, as many assumed, but to someone else entirely. She leaned back, knitting untouched, the rain tapping softly at the window. This, she murmured, isn't over. The hint of a larger game. Later that day, Inspector Harley stopped by for tea. She showed him the letter. His expression hardened. "Do you think—" "I don't think, Inspector." "I know," she interrupted gently. "Someone has been moving pieces far beyond this one case. And if they've written to me, it means I'm part of their game now." Harley frowned. "Then we should be careful." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes sharper than ever. "Careful, yes, but also ready." Outside, the rain grew heavier, as though the village itself braced for the next storm. Chapter 10. The Mastermind in the Shadows. A visitor at dusk. 3 nights after receiving the letter, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, the firelight flickering against the walls. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and still. At exactly 9 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate taps. When she opened it, a tall man in a dark overcoat stood there. His face was mostly hidden beneath the brim of a hat, but his voice was smooth, almost charming. "You've been asking the right questions, Miss Marple, but not to the right people. The confession." He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his boots leaving faint mud trails on the carpet. "I orchestrated everything," he said casually, as if discussing the weather. "Sir Reginald's death, the disappearance of the will, even the false trail leading to poor Edward Whitford. It was all necessary." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Necessary? For whom?" "For the family's survival," he replied. "Sir Reginald was about to ruin us all with a decision that would, let's say, open the wrong doors to the wrong people." The name revealed. She studied him in silence before speaking. "You're Charles Whitford, the cousin who vanished years ago." He smirked. "I see the stories about your cleverness were true." "The offer." Charles leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You could expose me, of course. But if you do, others far more dangerous than I will come for you. Work with me instead, Miss Marple. Help me control what's coming." Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. "I don't work with murderers, Mr. Whitford. I stop them." A vanishing act. Before she could reach for the phone, Charles slipped something onto the table. Another envelope, and walked to the door. "Read it when you're alone," he said, tipping his hat. "Then decide if you truly want the truth." When Miss Marple opened the door seconds later, he was gone. No footsteps, no sign he'd ever been there. The final twist. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. Sir Reginald shaking hands with a man Miss Marple instantly recognized. A man officially declared dead 10 years ago. She looked out into the darkness, her mind already piecing together the next puzzle. "This," she whispered, "is only the beginning." Chapter 11. The Hidden Web. The cold drizzle tapped against the window of Miss Marple's small rented flat in London. She sat at her desk, the firelight casting long shadows on the walls, papers scattered before her. For hours she had been going over every note, every statement, every timeline. Something had been gnawing at her, a faint detail she had overlooked. And then it clicked. She grabbed a faded envelope from the stack, the one retrieved from Colonel Whitmore's study. Inside was a letter, dated 2 years earlier, addressed to a name she had seen before. Eleanor Whitmore, the Colonel's late wife. But the signature at the bottom wasn't from a friend or family member. It was from Lord Alfred Cavendish, the same aristocrat whose financial empire had been quietly funding shadow operations across Europe. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just a murder. This was part of a much older game. She mapped it out on a sheet of paper. Eleanor Whitmore had known about the smuggling of rare artifacts during the war. She had tried to warn someone, but was silenced. Colonel Whitmore's accidental death was no accident. He was close to exposing the same network. Every suspect in the current case had a different motive, but all roads led back to Lord Cavendish. Miss Marple's mind raced. If Cavendish was involved, that meant influence in Parliament, police corruption, and something bigger. A knock at the door. It was Inspector Graves, pale, drenched, visibly shaken. "Miss Marple, you need to come with me. Now. There's been another death." Her heart sank. Another death meant the killer was desperate. As they drove through the foggy streets, Graves explained in clipped tones. "Sir Reginald Clark, found dead in his library. Poisoned. Just like the Colonel." Miss Marple leaned back in the seat, her mind calculating. Reginald Clark, the banker who handled Cavendish's offshore accounts. This wasn't random. This was cover-up. The killer was tying loose ends before Miss Marple could connect them. In that moment, she knew the next 24 hours would be decisive. One wrong move, and not only would the killer escape, but the entire web of corruption would vanish in smoke. She whispered to herself, "Time's running out, and the spider's almost done with the web." Chapter 12. The final confrontation. The storm raged outside Cavendish Hall, the grand countryside estate of Lord Alfred Cavendish. The wind howled through the ancient chimneys, rattling the glass. As Miss Marple stood in the dimly lit drawing room, her cane tapping softly against the marble floor. Around her, the suspects gathered. Inspector Graves, Lady Henrietta Whitmore, Oliver Trent, and finally, Lord Cavendish himself, dressed immaculately in a dark suit, his expression calm. Almost too calm. Miss Marple began quietly, her voice steady but sharp. 3 murders in the space of 2 weeks. Colonel Whitmore, Reginald Clark, and, years before, Eleanor Whitmore. All poisoned. All connected. Lord Cavendish smirked. "You have quite the imagination, Miss Marple. But where is your proof?" She stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. "The proof," she said, "is in the letters you thought you burned. You see, Reginald Clark kept duplicates. And when I found the missing page in your study, the one detailing your illegal trade in stolen, wartime artifacts, I knew the truth. Colonel Whitmore was about to go public, so you silenced him. Clark demanded more money to keep quiet, so you silenced him as well. And Eleanor, she was simply the first to stand in your way." The room went dead silent. Lady Henrietta gasped. Oliver Trent shifted uneasily. Inspector Graves' hand rested on his revolver. Cavendish's face hardened, the mask finally slipping. "You clever old woman. Do you have any idea what I could have done for this country with that money?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Yes, you could have funded more murders." Cavendish lunged forward, but Graves was faster. In a blur, the inspector had him pinned, handcuffs snapping shut. As the rain hammered against the windows, Graves read him his rights. Cavendish didn't resist. He only gave Miss Marple a cold, calculating smile. "This isn't over," he said. Miss Marple didn't flinch. "Oh, I do hope it is. I have knitting to finish." Epilogue. 2 weeks later, Cavendish was charged with 3 counts of murder, smuggling and conspiracy. The newspapers called Miss Marple the Iron Rose of England, though she returned quietly to her village, content with her garden and tea. Yet, as she sipped her Earl Grey one crisp morning, she unfolded a letter with no return address. Inside, only one sentence. "You caught the spider, but the web remains." Miss Marple smiled faintly. The game, she knew, was never truly over.